Hello, everyone. Welcome to the podcast. I'm here with James Watson, Fractional VP of Sales for Sales Catapult, part of the Global Sales Acceleration Network. And we're going to actually talk about a really interesting topic today, especially critically important for high growth startups, which is why there are so many bad sales hires and what can be done about it. James, thanks again for joining the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Eric. I appreciate it.
No worries. James, why don't you give our audience a bit of background about yourself and why the bad sales hire is such a big part of your experience in your career?
Okay, so just going back really quickly, first of all, what I do now is I'm a fractional VP of sales for a company called Sales Catapult, which is part of a global network called Sales Acceleration, which is made up of 180 fractional VPs of sales that have no less than 20 years of leadership experience. I happen to have over 30 years of leadership experience, having worked with startups all the way to very well-funded companies, mid-sized companies, and so I've helped startups, get their next rounds of funding, and I've helped to take a $100 million company to $2 billion.
So James, that's an impressive resume, and that definitely sounds like your sales process, your sales hires. So let me ask you this flat out: why do you think there's so many bad sales hires, and what can be done to resolve the issue?
Well, I think there are some universal truths, and then there are some truths that you could kind of segment into. Is it a startup? Is it a well-funded startup? Is it an experienced company? And so, but one of the things that I noticed that really cuts across all three is that a lot of companies, believe it or not, don't have a defined value prop. They may have their their tagline, and they may put it out there sometimes, but they're not consistent with it in all their messaging, and not every one of their employees is aware of what that value prop is. And so that's a process in and of itself, an exercise that one goes through to establish that value prop. That is one key factor. The other is being able to take that, and then what the culture of the company is, and you got to decide that too, and then fit that into your job description, and to be very specific about it. And then you've got to have, if the CEO or the founder or founders don't have sales experience, they might have a difficult time without assistance, putting together an effective sales job description. It's not something that is just canned and that you can just look up on the internet and figure it out, which I think there's a lot of that going on. And then, so if there's that lack of sales experience, unless they happen to have been in a sales role before, that is definitely an Achilles heel.
It's interesting you bring up value proposition and culture, and I think for a lot of our audience, they thought that really matters, because isn't it just metrics driven? Like, if you get me sales, you get me revenues, that's all that should matter. But can you expand a bit more on why value proposition is such an important thing, particularly for hiring, I don't want to say competent sales personnel, but maybe just like sales personnel that fit the company or the startup?
Yeah, so you brought up a good point. Also, you do need to know what someone's metrics, or you need to know that they fit the role, first of all, before they even get into consideration. But what this is really about is getting it down to where you got 10 people or 5 people, and then ultimately 3 in serious consideration. And then how are you interviewing them? What process are you putting them through? What is the job description that you gave? And in being very, clear about that, it's important to point out and not sugarcoat what will be expected. And that goes back over into the metrics you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
As there are a lot of people that have been great in their past lives, and they're high school heroes, and as far as sports, as far as business goes. But are they still willing to do what they did before? And that's another thing, is you have to be very careful, depending on the level of person you're bringing in. They can talk all day long about how well they did in the past, but have them describe a week in the life of what they do now.
Interesting. So it's not relying on past glories, it's relying on what can you do, or otherwise known as, can you hit the ground running? That's very critical.
Exactly. And can you articulate that on the fly, which is a skill in and of itself. And I'll talk about that a little bit later.
Very true. I actually want to talk about, just before we get to that, the second point, you mentioned culture. And why is culture such an important thing nowadays for startups, particularly when it comes to their sales hires?
I think it's absolutely critical because you had the quote unquote great resignation.
Hmm.
That's been the topic of discussion. And, I just did with some colleagues of mine that I network with a webinar that was actually called The Great Realization, because it is less about just a resignation. It's the realization that it is, the culture of the company that means everything right now, because, there are even studies out on it that millennials would rather be unemployed than to work somewhere where they're not happy. And so there's a whole lifestyle thing. And then obviously
Hmm.
the pandemic impacted things, and it opened the doors up too for, people to be able to not just be tied into their one little geographical area. They can work remotely. For example, my last job, 3 positions after I was a long time in a W-2 at a
Hmm.
company regionally, have been and I'm in Los Angeles, have been in New York, in San Francisco, and in Seoul, South Korea.
Hmm.
So that, and I was already doing this because of the nature of my work. And so it wasn't a big transition for me, but for a lot of people, it was a huge transition, and it was an eye opener, both on the employer side and the employee side. I think the employers are lagging behind a little bit in adapting to this whole new world, and then maybe having people come in the office or not, and being able to work remotely.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a different podcast topic right there. But you brought up a third one, which I thought was very interesting, and you tied it with culture, which is the job description. Uh, what what makes a bad job description, or what makes a good one? I mean, what have you seen more of, and how can startups and their founders, as they're hiring for great salespeople, fix that?
Well, I think when if you back it up, it's a different answer if it's an established company like doing 10 million ARR. They may just have to revamp their job description. They might be doing all right, but they need to go to another level.
Hmm.
With startups, it's a different beast, because if they don't have their Series A, maybe they've got some bootstrap, or whatever, family and friends funding, however they've gotten their money so far, but they, will end up having to initially, especially if they're getting money from a VC, or any kind of angel investor, any kind of outside money. Those people are, even if they've already given them some money, they're not going to give them a second round of funding unless they see them succeed, unless they see them as a proof of concept doing it themselves. So
Hmm.
that creates a bit of a quandary, because they've got the advantage of knowing about their product, being passionate about it. Maybe they've got a patent on it, and they got the hype of getting the funding, and then they do okay coming out of the gate. But then
Hmm.
6 8 months down the line, they haven't they know they're going to have to hire someone, their first sales hire, whether it's a leader, or whether it's usually going to be a player coach, and they know they
Hmm.
have to hire them. But and maybe they've succeeded even, but what the problem is that they may not even have a CRM, and they may not be tracking their metrics and the data to understand if they're doing a good job, a great job, what does that look like? And also to remember that it's going to be a heck of a lot easier for a founder, a CEO, to sell what they know and what they're passionate about than to bring someone in from the outside. So what they really need to be doing is early on, gathering empirical data. And that's something that a lot of them fail to do. And one of the best ways to do that is to bring in even if you're just doing it for like 5-10 hours a week, have someone making calls, and you can do it at a pretty low cost, and then gather that empirical data, so that you then know 3 months in, or maybe 6 months in, whatever it is, how long does it take, how many calls does it take to get a meeting? How many meetings does it take to get a deal? What's the deal worth? How many deals could someone be expected to do? From that, you can then help to write a job description, and then also understand how much, what kind of compensation you should have in place for this particular type of individual. So they got to get that part of it right too.
Interesting. I definitely like that data-driven approach, particularly in the age of AI and machine learning and data analytics. So that's definitely interesting. So we've kind of talked about, what impacts, the hiring of, let's say, bad sales hires. But we haven't actually defined it. So what's your definition of a bad sales hire?
A bad sales hire is someone that comes in and is not productive, and kind of drags. People stay committed to them, and a lot of times it'll take a year, and oftentimes longer. If you're dealing with HR type of issues and doing things from a legal perspective and what it actually takes. And I've dealt with that before, performance improvement plans. This is all, people have to be very careful about that. Plus, there have been studies on what the cost is of a bad hire. And so just like the recruiting process, the training, the onboarding, and you can get into weighted costs like lost opportunity costs, and so forth. But by the time you're done, a bad hire, if you're asking that direct question, is someone that's cost you a lot of money and they haven't given you results. And then they're either dragging and you keep them, which which just perpetuates the problem, or you cut your losses, and make them step up or step out.
Interesting. A lot to break down there. So I think you talked about, ill-defined value proposition, ill-defined culture, and impacting the job description. And it's interesting that you brought up the metrics, especially when it comes to job description. But I think how do I put this? So if it is a bad hire, what, in your opinion, are some of the things that a startup founder should know or should be looking for to identify this is going to be a bad hire?
Yeah, that's a good discussion. That's a good question. What they really should do is, the tendency initially, especially for the earlier stage, and it's understandable, is to just kind of charge and be inside the tornado and try to get results on the sales side, and not really get a lot of outside help on the sales and marketing side. They really go hand in hand. But then to spend most of the money on, if it's a tech type of company, on their UI, on whatever their apps are, whatever their DevOps is that they got to work on. And so the tendency is to lean on that and then to rely on the other side. Whereas what I believe is that there needs to really be a paradigm shift, and frankly, investors should even expect it, that there is it doesn't have to be a tremendous amount of money, but that there is at least as much effort leaning on outside help, knowing that the majority of these founders, especially like in the tech world, science backgrounds, they're not matched. Some of them maybe, just happen to be, gregarious people and connect, but even those don't necessarily have sales experience. And a lot of times they're younger founders too, I'm finding more and more. So they couldn't have had a ton of experience. They've gotten their, a degree at MIT, and they're getting out and they got a great idea they've been working on. Well, they don't have practical business experience. They may have a great product or service. And so I think getting outside help sooner than later, and then being able to create, which someone that is good at it will help to create that value prop. They'll help to create the 30-second, the 60-second, the 1-minute pitches. They'll help to create the 4-minute, the 8-minute, the 16-minute PowerPoints that are needed. And some of those are also very specific to dealing with investors. And if an investor knows that you've got a plan and you've got a timeline, you've actually got like a playbook, and you've got someone, or at least a plan for people that are going to help you out, that's going to completely contract the amount of time, or shrink the amount of time that it takes to get that funding, and could increase the amount of funding. So now I've circled back to make this about funding, but that's their end game. And so how they position themselves doesn't matter what they do if they don't get that next round of funding. They'll die on the vine, like the statistics show. Within 1 year, it's 20%. Within 2 years, it's 50%, and I believe that climbs up because they're not getting their next round of funding, and they're just trying to survive. And then within 10 years, 70% fail. So I would argue that whatever everyone is doing, and that everyone thinks they should be following, I would do the opposite. Um, and take a harder look at, I'm kind of kidding, but take a harder look at what can they do early on to get help with sales. And they presume it's going to be tremendously expensive, but it's more costly not to do it, to get those processes into place.
I think you hit the nail on the head, right? Everyone, I think there's like a misconception, and you kind of mentioned it in terms of, oh, salespeople are naturally gregarious and that will get the sale, right? But I think you kind of alluded to the fact that sales processes are critical, and sales can take a data-driven approach and should take a data-driven approach. And it's just as important as, when an early stage startup goes through an accelerator, they're shaping their message. They should also be shaping their sales processes, which is, I think, what you're saying as well.
Exactly. And typically, and I've even recently been involved in, assisting with a startup with some funding, and that's been a different experience in kind of positioning it from a go-to-market. And, they want to know, all right, what's the ROI going to be? What's the best case, the worst case scenario? What kind of ARR, if it's a, SaaS type of a model, can we expect after 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, and so forth. And, the positioning there is, I think that most startups, they will get someone or do it themselves and get the numbers right. But, they're not going to have under the hood what it takes to go at that speed, to be able to get there. They in many instances are making a promise, but they're not really, and they're backing their way kind of into some of the metrics that it might take to get there. But then they just say, well, we're going to hire a VP of sales in 8 months. And then they hire an equity-based a VP of sales that earns $60K. That's not a VP of sales. But the investors are, kind of buying it as such. And so I think it's important, they can hire that person, but they need to get some more professional experience, someone that's really been there and done that, and then make that part of the go-to market plan, because they all will come up with the right numbers. They'll tell the investors what they want to hear, and that's fine. And some of them will get there. But the question is it a scientific approach? Are they able to create a foundation of predictable, results, and repeatable, so that they can, take that as they grow and say, we now have the mousetrap. We know what great looks like, and we're going to bring the right people in because we got the right job description, and then we're going to have the right certification and onboarding for them. We're going to certify them. We're going to tie them to a mentor, and then get them up to speed. Make them do their first few deals with that mentor. That mentor may be the one of the founders. But this helps to make the results more predictable and helps to ensure success, and certainly can help to avoid failure.
It's interesting you talk about predictability, and you kind of have the stages in terms of recruiting, interviewing, training, and onboarding. If I were to focus on recruiting, obviously we've talked about the job description, but in terms of recruiting, what are some other tips? Because obviously, if it's, let's say, an early stage startup founder, like you said, they're highly technically or scientifically proficient, they may have a network that is very technical and engineering focused. How can they potentially find a salesperson that meets their criteria, even though they have a limited network?
There's a couple ways. One is, which is a little more costly, but very effective, is to use an outside recruiter that focuses on sales. And because that first hire is very important, and it takes about 2 months to bring someone in. The other way is to, kind of do the DIY, and get onto LinkedIn, make sure you have LinkedIn Sales Navigator. That's number one. That's really important. And then, you can have additional marketing exposure and options there to market. And then there's other, other resources that are, inexpensive as well to do that. But then, if you're going down that road, it's going to be less expensive than bringing, hiring a recruiter from outside.
Hmm.
But then I would still suggest getting help in writing that job description, in being involved with the interviews. I mean, that's something that I actually do. If someone is not, we have our own internal recruiting, but I understand if they're budget conscious, then they're going to, they might opt not to do that. And then, there can be assistance with kind of going A through Z and creating all that, without too shamelessly promoting myself. That's just in general what we fractional VPs of sales do. And especially with the early stages. And a lot of my peers won't even touch startups because they know that it's budget constrained, and they know that there's just, a lot of, it's unpredictable, and it can be very challenging because you're kind of building things ground up. I happen to, have embraced it because I've worked for startups. I like the area. I like the tech side of things. So, I enjoy working on that side of it. But whether it's, doesn't need to be me, they may know other people that can help them with, getting that together, and they can go at it alone. Then once they get that first person in place, then maybe, I would then recommend, your next hire, if you're going for a sales manager, or you're going for, senior level rep, you could go through connections again, and maybe, you might be good if you get a great recommendation, and LinkedIn's good for that. Your network's good for that. But like you said, if their network is mainly, uh, tech people, people with a tech background of some sort, or scientific background, they're not necessarily going to have that network. And so I think, if they don't, then it's, definitely is important to tap into people that do, number one. And then once you can, look into using an outside recruiter, because they have processes, and I know the ones that I work with do, that are very effective in making sure that you get the right person in the right seat.
Interesting. And I think you kind of indirectly addressed it, which is the interviewing process. So if let's say an early stage founder is you know is deciding whether to use a recruiter or go through their connections, what should they be looking for in the interview? And let me define the question, because I think you hit the nail on the head. I think we have this stereotype of sales hires. As long as you're outgoing, extroverted, and gregarious, you'll be able to sell snow to Eskimos, right? But the reality is a lot more complex. So, what can a early stage startup founder potentially do, or ask, or think about in the interview process to make sure that a sales hire candidate is the right fit?
Yeah, so that goes to, there's some fundamental questions that obviously need to be asked. I would say look back, my process personally, as a hiring manager, either as a consultant or in corporate America, was to have a defined process that I would go through, and we called it like a top grading interview, which what it meant. There's a whole program behind it, but they go back to 3 jobs. I would, in the interest of time, I would just go back 2 jobs. But what I would do is not just necessarily go back to the 2 most recent jobs. I would go back to the most relevant job, besides their most recent job,
Hmm.
even if it was like 10 years ago, because if that mirrors what they are saying they can do now, and maybe then I want to dig down into that, because now I'm going to look at, kind of use that as a benchmark against their most recent job and what they're doing now. Because if they have climbed the ladder and they're now doing a specialist position, or they're in management, and they're applying for a job because they need to, or they want to leave where they are, they might say anything in order to get in, even if it's a stopgap. And then you run the risk of, that's what you are. You're just a launching pad for them while they're still continuing to find their real job, and they get away with it for a while. But you really need to drill down and compare what they've done recently, and it's okay. Describe to me, define to me what a typical week for you would be in your current job, or if they don't have a job right now in their last position. And then I'll go
Hmm.
back to the other one. I'll talk about that. But then I, will start digging in more and more into their current job, and does that experience and does their current willingness, they might have the skill because they've done it before, but it's always a skill and will game. Now, do they have the will to still do it? And then after they define their week, I haven't told them what the week is. I define them. I then tell them, well, this is a typical week in the life of a rep of ours. And they that will either lead to them saying, no, I'm good with that. And then I'm going to, of course, ask second, third level questions and dig into that more. Tell me more about that. Tell me what you're doing now, or what would make me, believe that you're willing to continue doing that, or it sends them packing. And you might have hired that person.
That's an interesting perspective, but I do like the fact that you're kind of diving deep into someone's background, and I guess more or less looking for that growth and consistency in terms of their sales methodology, if I were to use that term, which is very interesting, and I think a good element. I think one of the
depends what you hire. It depends what you're hiring them for. If it's someone that had this career progression and they've ended up as a manager, and you're now hiring for a hunter farmer that's to be developed as a manager, well, then the question is not, are you willing to do 20 cold calls or warm calls a day? It's, are you willing to do that for 6 months in order to get to the next level here? Because we're actually hiring more of a player coach that we then want to graduate up into doing more enterprise type deals, bringing people along. And then once we have a few people on board, then they become a manager. That's a different story than if you're hiring someone as a junior BD rep and they are a manager right now, and they've been in the workforce, for a long time. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it's fair to ask the question, are you willing to do this still? And this is what a real week in your life will look like. I just want you to be aware of that.
That makes 100% sense, and I fully agree with that. I think another thing, in the interview process, usually later stages, is the discussion of sales compensation. So, I mean, what are some of the issues that you've run into in your experience related to sales comp? Is it too rich sometimes? Is it misconstructed? Or all of the above?
Sometimes it's too rich. Oftentimes it's misconstructed because people will look up, okay, what is the OTE, which is on target earnings. And so that's typically in sales a combination of your base salary plus a variable component. So for example, what's not uncommon in sales is to be a 2-buy of your base salary. So if someone gets paid $60,000, for example, if they hit their quota, their target, they would get another 60,000, or some prorated amount of that if they're lower, or a good comp plan will reward them if they're higher. Won't cap them, because all they're doing is paying a percentage of the additional profit they're getting anyway. So usually it's not that there's too much high-end compensation that I've seen, although that can exist. It's more that ratio of, people will lean towards, thinking that they got to go 80%, 70 or 80% on the base, and then the variable, 20 to 30%. And that is a comp plan for what I call a farmer, not for a hunter. A hunter should have more of a 50-50 balanced comp plan that really incentivizes them and allows them to earn a lot more than a farmer. A farmer, you need to do, really focus on, doing certain metrics, and they could have what's called an MBO, management by objectives, where, the amount of meetings they do and trainings they do and the time they spend with clients actually determines their compensation, their variable portion of their compensation. So that drives behavior. Whereas that in and of itself does not work for sales. And so the biggest thing I see is that's kind of, flip-flop there, or everyone is or most are paying what they, a really high base salary. And it's not giving the incentive. They can kind of get fat and happy off of that base salary, unless there's some conditions that are tied to get them. The one scenario, the person earning 60 to get to 120, they got to hit quota. The person, earning, much higher base to get to 120, they don't quite have the same incentive, nor should they. But it's a matter of understanding what the position holds and then writing the job description to that. But then also that in and of itself becomes a filter, because there are a lot of people that will not, and this is how you also vet out the ones that aren't true salespeople. The salesperson will take a lower base for the opportunity of a higher compensation, more risk reward. The more of a client relationship manager, if you will, it will not take that job, and that's good. You don't want them in that job, but people keep hiring them for that job.
Yeah, exactly. I think that the classic hunter farmer switch is something that I think a lot of people, especially that don't necessarily do sales, they kind of forget about or aren't aware of, right? And I think you hit the nail on the head, particularly for a true BD salesperson that you want to hire, especially from early stage startup. So with, obviously, let's say you find the right candidate, you've done the right things on recruiting, you've done the right things on in the interview, you've agreed on comp and figured out an appropriate base salary. I think you also mentioned something about training and onboarding, right? What do you think a lot of companies forget to do, or startups forget to do, when it comes to onboarding and providing training, whether it's initial onboarding training or ongoing training with regards to sales, or even the product or service that the startup is building?
It's a lack of structure and a lack of experience in doing it. And so oftentimes it doesn't even exist. It's just like, just work with me, shadow. Now that's an important component of the onboarding process, but it's only a component of the process. And they fail to go into the why story of the company. What is the value proposition of the company? Well, if they don't even know what it is themselves 100%, they're not going to be able to get everyone else, teach other people, to learn that. What are the metrics that are, that need to be included? All of this goes into, I personally, wherever I go in, there's some, things that I'll use that are templated, but then they all become customized to that individual client. And I have to spend a lot of time with them doing assessments and then figuring out, okay, how can I put together a 2-week certification program, and what's going to be included with that? And that's going to include a lot of things. It's going to include meetings with all the division heads and spending time with them and getting to know, learning about their side of the business. And that becomes critically important later on, beyond the certification into the latter part of the onboarding, because there really needs to be cross-functional collaboration, which is another thing that's kind of missing out there. And these are, I'm mentioning that now, even though that has nothing to do with hiring, but it kind of does, because if you have a good hiring process, you get the right person and you train them the right way, they are going to be working across divisions and understanding how important it is to work with marketing, with IT, with the sales ops, HR, you name it. They're all, every division, even finance, it's all important. And they're understanding how to, about those divisions. I mean, those are just some examples of things that would be included. And that's just, then beyond that, you got to kind of break the training down into the fundamentals, which all these people that get hired, anyone who gets hired by this time, they should understand the whole concept of the sales cycle of, profiling a company, doing persona profiling before, making warm calls to get meetings, knowing how to pitch, knowing how to present, knowing how to create, value props for the client, being able to uncover that with great qualifying forms and questions, and asking second, third level questions, and then being able to take that and then do a presentation and then move it towards the close, then move that client towards their onboarding, and then maintaining that client and making sure that they renew and that you are growing the business with that client. Those things are critical, because initially, and if you don't set them up right up from the onset, you can have problems, because you might still do all right, but a typical startup might have like 70% of its business, initially 100%, but then, maybe a year in or something, have 70% of its business coming from new clients, new logos. Whereas once you get further and further along, it should flatten out a little bit to where 70% of your business should be coming from your existing clients, either directly or indirectly, either through expansion, referrals, and working it smart. And so later on, you may have to hire beyond salespeople, you may have to hire specific client relationship managers, but initially the salesperson has to wear all those hats. And so getting them set up initially for that is actually very critical, because you got to think ahead.
And I think it's interesting you mentioned that. It's about that future vision and all that. I think a lot of early stage founders I've met, they have a clear future vision in terms of their product or their service, but not necessarily the nitty gritty of, let's call it, operational processes such as sales, right? The sales process. So, but I think a lot of founders would say, well, do I really need to build this foundation? Because that seems very corporate and bureaucratic to me. So what would your response be to that, to be perfectly honest?
Well, I don't know. I'd say I'd rather be corporate and bureaucratic than out of business. So that's what I would say to that.
Interesting. And then let me ask you this, because I think to your point, a lot of people would state that, hey, I just need a sales guy or person, excuse me, who should be fun, gregarious, and outgoing, and that'll solve my issue. And I've seen that works a lot at the beginning, but it fades over time. And is it something that we have to get out of that stereotypical mindset, more or less, and literally think that this is another function that we should be using data and metrics and processes to drive?
100%. And it goes back to the skill and will thing, because especially if someone is, think about this, if someone that is a non-salesperson, doesn't have experience, is evaluating a salesperson, that salesperson may be great at whatever they do, may not be great for this company. And they may be gregarious, as you put it, and they may have the will. But then the question is, do they have the skill to do this job? And you got to make the job description as such and do your due diligence based on that. And then do they have the will to do the necessary activity that will be required to do this job effectively? Not just talking a game, not just talking about their past experience, but being able to, being willing, especially if they're coming into a startup, and if they come from corporate and they've been, and I face this going from corporate into startups, is that they're too institutionalized. And they want to have that kind of freewheeling. They don't want to be so bureaucratic, and as you put it, and but there's an element of it that I believe really fits in, and it doesn't have to be done, in this draconian fashion of micromanaging people and creating this culture that people don't want, and especially the younger generations. You don't need to do that. For me, it was really kind of pivoting, and when I started having a lot of millennials working for me, and I watched a lot of managers around me, it really blow it, because they would keep trying to manage with that iron fist, and you certainly cannot. You can't even do that in corporate America anymore, let alone with startups. And so what I really realized is, just like with clients, you got to make sure you understand what makes these folks tick, what's important for them, what are their objectives, and as soon as they understand that you genuinely are there to help them achieve their objectives, and then put it back on them, allow them to own it, and then have them write an action plan that's based on what the expectations are, and say, okay, this is what it typically is going to take. I want you to put something together that you can own. And then they got to present it. Well, they own it now. But that led to not having turnover and people not bolting after 3 months and 6 months, as was common with a lot of the millennials. They're like, I'm out of here. If they didn't feel they were being valued and appreciated. And so I think you have to be in tune with that, while you're still kind of being firm and saying, this is what has to be done. But you don't do it. Most people most companies and individuals make the mistake of doing that after there's already a problem. Well, to me, the key is, don't allow the problem to get there. Make sure you got the right people in place, make sure there's proper expectations. They can never come back to you then and say, this isn't what I signed up for.
Be proactive versus reactive. That's good food for thought. So James, as this has been a great discussion, as you know, I always let my guests have the final word. So what would your final word be on this topic, this critically important topic, for startups?
Yeah, I would say just start, get on to LinkedIn Sales Navigator. Make sure that you have profile forms, client profile forms. And if you want to get really into the weeds, get persona profiles on the different type of buyers, that are in the different vertical or verticals that you have. Create a value proposition, whatever it takes to be able to get that, and make sure that everyone in your organization, if you have, a receptionist or an office manager, you got 15 people, whatever, every single one of them should be able to, in an elevator or at an event, articulate, have a 10-second and a 30-second pitch about what the company does. That also helps with consistency in all your marketing materials, your social media, your website. Take a look at that, and then create qualifying forms that will help you to flesh out what are good candidates, and then be able to write a job description, and then have interview questions that go back to a relevant experience, but then to their recent experience, and then benchmark those, and then really challenge them on that, and then ask second, third level questions. Well, instead of saying a yes or no answer, would you be good at this? Yes, I would.
Mm-hmm.
It's tell me why you would be good at this. Well, and then they tell you why, and you say, well, tell me more about that. How would you accomplish that? It's just it's just some fundamental things to get them talking, because it will raise to the surface the truth, and it'll help you to decide whether or not, much more quickly, whether to take that candidate seriously.
Makes sense.
So those are some of the takeaways that I would say right away could be helpful. And as far as anyone, anyone that wants to get some guidance on this, I actually have complimentary, assessment that I do. That's just a 10-question assessment that you fill out, and you get immediate feedback, and you're not obligated to do anything with it. I get that feedback too. And then we can have a discussion about it, but it makes for a meaningful discussion to look at it and say, you know what, based on the sales agility assessment, you're pretty strong over here. You're okay here, but you're completely lacking here. Let's talk about this. Maybe there's a reason, to create some kind of statement of, some kind of engagement, where, I can potentially help out. And if people want to get a hold of me, my cell phone is first of all, again, it's James Watson, and I'm on LinkedIn and my company Sales Catapult. My cell phone number is 310-488-1864. Again, 310-488-1864. And my email is jwatsonxcelerration.com. So that's sales acceleration, but there's no E before the X. So if I can be of assistance to anyone, or anyone that's looking to scale their sales 20-30% year over year, then I can potentially help them.
Excellent. Well, James, we'll definitely include the contact information in the description for the podcast, so anyone can reach out to you. And again, James, thanks again for joining the podcast and giving us your great insights on sales hires.
Thank you very much, Eric. I appreciate you having me.